But for anyone who doesn't know, my name's John Foster. I'm a librarian here in the Adult Services Division at Mentor Public Library. I have a doctorate in history from the University of Washington. My specialty was Germany, and my subspecialty was really East Germany. One of these days I'll do something on East Germany if I can con you people into coming to see it. Although East Germany is really fascinating. It's funny. It's like a horrible little state in which 5% of the people were spying on the other 95%. But it's really interesting for that reason too. Anyway, so this is the second talk in my Presidents of the 20th Century. I tried to pick presidents that hadn't been overdone, let's just say. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, okay, there's been a lot on him, but I learned a lot, so I felt all right about that. But so tonight's going to be Woodrow Wilson. In a couple months I'll be doing Truman, and then, so I tried to sort of pick pairs that made sense. So I know that there's an intervening period of Ohio's favorite son, William Howard Taft, between Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. But Taft, does anyone know what William Howard Taft's favorite meal was? It was possum and taters. He was the first person to have possum served in the White House. I asked one of my colleagues upstairs what she thought his favorite meal was, and she said everything. I mean, he's 320 pounds, so it wasn't like he was pushing food off the plate. So Woodrow Wilson, I picked Woodrow Wilson. One reason I picked him was because Wilson's presidency is a real sort of turning point for the United States in the broad scope of the history of this country. We had been not quite an inward-looking country. I mean, we were very active in our own hemisphere in the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, the fact that we had sort of promulgated the Monroe Doctrine is an illustration to you about the sorts of things that American foreign policy was oriented toward. But Wilson's presidency represents a moment at which the United States really kind of moves outside of this and moves in the direction of the sort of foreign policy orientation that it would have for the rest of the 20th century. Not only politically, but also financially. So this is the sort of moment at which the real transition happens, where the sort of financial center of the world moves from London to New York. And that's a really profound and important change, especially today. Wilson's family were from a lot of places in the British Isles. His father, his grandparents came from Tyrone in what's now Northern Ireland. They moved to Steubenville. They came to a lot of places, but they moved to Steubenville. But then they moved to Staunton, Virginia, which is where Woodrow Wilson was born. His father was a Presbyterian minister and theologian. He moved around a lot. He ended up teaching at a number of different seminaries, for a while in Columbia, South Carolina, for a while in Augusta, Georgia. Woodrow Wilson, this is Joseph Ruggles Wilson, that's his father. Woodrow Wilson, whose real first name was Thomas, he was called Tommy for about the first 15 or 18 years of his life, was born in December of 1856, so he was born 4 or 5 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, and his earliest memories were of the South, of the antebellum South. His family probably owned a small number of slaves. They were in the right class to do so. I haven't found a huge amount of information about that, but a number of sources say they did. His father was, once again, a Presbyterian minister. Right around the time of the Civil War, the Presbyterian Church split into a sort of northern and southern version, and it split essentially over the issue of slavery was one sort of big part of it. His father went with the southern side, which is why he ended up in Augusta, Georgia for the balance of the war. Wilson was old enough to remember, I mean, so by the end of the war he's 10 years old, 10 years old. And so he can remember the intense destruction that happened in the American Civil War in the South. I will say, to a room full of Ohioans, that, and I was born in Iowa, that I, as a Northerner, born and bred, I have very little sympathy for anything associated with the Confederacy. I don't think it was noble. I think it was pretty awful. But it did have a very profound, so when I look at the destruction, I think to myself, well, next time, maybe think better of that bad idea. That is, say, the idea of starting a civil war. Not really our fault, I think it was theirs. But anyway, be that as it may. These are images. This is from Richmond. I believe that is Charleston, South Carolina, and that's from the west side of Atlanta. Wilson grew up in this landscape, in this sort of landscape of the destruction of war, the aftermath of the war, the so-called Reconstruction after the war, which made a lot of Southerners very bitter, right? Because there was this idea that Northerners, Northern opportunists, who they referred to as carpetbaggers, were coming down, trying to sort of profit off the destruction of the war, also forcing them to accept African Americans into the political life of the country down there, which they were still very firmly opposed to. And these were the sort of profound and defining experiences of Wilson's childhood. He started out, he went for a year to Davidson College in North Carolina. He kind of worked himself sick and ended up having to leave. And then, so his father was being visited by, who was also a Presbyterian minister and was the president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, and who suggested that Woodrow might want to come north and go to the College of New Jersey. Now, Princeton in those days was a kind of different place than, I mean, so you think Princeton, right? This is like the northern, whatever. Princeton in those days was a sort of elite drinking club. A lot of the sons of a lot of Southern families would go to. There was a very pronounced Southern population at Princeton in those days. And so Wilson went up there. He had a pretty good time. He liked to play baseball, although he was not especially physically fit. He was more one of those sort of rah-rah guys, I mean, those of you who've been on sports teams, like they'll always have like the manager, who's like the guy who really, he's sort of like Rudy, right? He's the guy who like loves the team but isn't quite good enough to actually play on it. But that's fine. The world needs those people too. After he finished, he decided he wanted to go into law, so he went to the University of Virginia Law School. For a year. Now, back in those days, legal education was a little less rigorous and strenuous than it is today. And he went to the University of Virginia Law School for a couple of years, and then he just read law for a while and went down to Georgia, passed the Georgia bar in 1982. And when I say passed, was just admitted to it, like they didn't quite do like the system of systematic exams like they do now. And he started a law practice with a sort of college friend of his, which had no clients from his. He was sort of in the middle of deciding that he didn't really want to be a lawyer. So he had this law practice that kind of went nowhere for a while. And then he decided that what he was really interested in was sort of political science or learning about sort of the history of politics. So he got himself admitted to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he studied for and received a doctorate in 1886. While he was doing this, he had an uncle, I believe, whose estate had was being mishandled back down in Georgia. He went down, ended up briefly meeting Ellen Axon, to whom he was somewhat related, although he'd had a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, abortive courtship with another young woman who really was his cousin. I mean, but back in those days, the sort of people were a little looser about that kind of thing. But I think the story goes that he was like raking leaves in his parents' garden or something like that, and he saw her go walking by and thought she was quite nice. And I'm just going to tell you this story. They had a very affectionate relationship. I mean, they really had a very wonderful marriage. He was at a later point when he was off. I think it was when he was during the time that he was at Princeton as a professor, not as a student. So they write these letters. Back in those days, people would write a lot of letters because that was the way. There was no email and no telephone. It was just. And he wrote this letter to her, which is quoted in Peter Berg's biography of Wilson, which is sort of the gold standard these days, in which he says, "I hope you are ready for the storm of lovemaking with which you will be assailed when I return." And I thought to myself, I didn't necessarily want to know that, to be 100% honest. But that's fine, whatever. He was just a normal person the way everyone else is. I thought it was interesting that Berg chose to include that particular detail, but now I've given it all to you. He taught briefly at Cornell and also at Bryn Mawr. Bryn Mawr, he constantly groused about teaching there because he didn't think that teaching at a women's college was the sort of way to advance. But he had this, those of you, there's one or two of you here who are in the men's book group, and we were here at the library, and we read Candace Millard's Hero of the Empire about Winston Churchill for this month. And we were talking when we met the other day about how if you're going to sort of go places in politics, it tends to, the people who tend to do it, right, are the people who have this sort of belief that they're meant to do it, right? So Churchill had this very pronounced belief that he was meant for whatever, because he kept going to these war zones and not getting killed. And so, you know, that it sort of, he believed that he was due for greater things. And Wilson also had this kind of belief that he thought from a very young age that he would make something of himself as a sort of leader, although he wasn't really exactly sure how he was going to do this. And then he went into academia and he thought to himself, well, the political leadership thing isn't going to happen, right? Because academia is one thing and politics is another. But so even at that, you know, he thought, well, I'm going to be a big wig in academia, right? So like teaching at Bryn Mawr, that's not that great. He was recruited by Princeton University, who paid him a pretty fabulous sum of money. I think that the offer was something like $1,000 a year, which is, for, you know, academics, a lot of money. He wrote about a 700-page book called The State, which was the standard textbook on, like, in politics in American universities for a long time. I've taught at university. I find it hard to believe that anybody, I mean, I've taught freshmen and sophomores, and I can just tell you that if you hand them a 700-page textbook on anything, they're going to be like, yeah, I think I'm dropping this class and taking underwater basket weaving or whatever it is that will get me my credits. But he became very interested in the English political writer Walter Paget. Paget is a really interesting guy. I really recommend, well, the two main books for which he's known: the English Constitution, which he wrote in 1867, which is a study of the English political system and how it worked, and Lombard Street, which he wrote in 1873, which is probably the clearest explanation of how a monetary crash actually happens. Like, he really, if you're interested in finding out how it is that like a currency crisis breaks out, that's as good an explanation, as straightforward an explanation as you'll ever read. Paget, his father was a very prominent banker. His father-in-law founded The Economist. He himself founded the National Review, and you'll see in 1855, so he was, what, 26, 27 years old when he, 31, he was 31 when he did. Okay, people did things a little younger in those days, right, because their lifespan was shorter too. And there were fewer of them. There was, you know, more space to do things. But one of the things that Paget was really adamant about was that if you wanted to understand the way a political system worked, yes, the English Constitution, look for the centers of power. And he said there are two parts of the Constitution. There's the dignified part, and there's the efficient part. And the dignified part is a kind of like, he thought of the House of Lords as the kind of dignified part. There's all these rituals and whatever. But if you really want to find out what's going on, look at the House of Commons and the way it happens. And also, don't get sort of caught up in the kind of pageantry of the sort of popular part of politics. He was an opponent of constituency government. So his theory basically was, and I'm grossly simplifying here for sake of time, that a politician shouldn't be one of these people who's constantly going back and polling his constituents. What he should do is say, this is my position on things. And if you elect me, this is what you're going to get. And if you don't like it, then in 2 years or 4 years, you get to elect somebody else. But so I'm not going to sit here and be taking constant opinion polls about whatever. What I am going to do is show you that I'm a person who has character and a person who shares the values that you do. And if you want that, then by electing me, what you're saying is that you're giving me not quite carte blanche, but that you want those things too. And then a couple of years down the road, you get a chance to make another decision if that's what you want. Wilson really took this to heart. And this comes out a lot in his sort of political life later on. Wilson was appointed president of Princeton in June 1902. And this is a sort of like the kind of, in a way, he felt like he had gotten to the kind of pinnacle of his life, because this is his alma mater, right? You know, and now he's become president of the place. And so he has a very grand plan for Princeton. What he wants to do is turn it into a real haven for scholarly life, Like, he doesn't like the idea, the whole gentleman's C, you know, does everyone know what I mean when I say the gentleman's C? Like, you know, you get a C just for showing up. And if you want to do better, that's fine, but, you know, it's basically, they had these, like, eating clubs that if you were sort of wealthy, you could be a part of, and there was a very pronounced sort of class system at Princeton, which Wilson, whatever else you could say about him, was very against that. I mean, what he wanted was a kind of community of learning that was irrespective of class. I mean, it was all about sort of achievement and merit and hard work and being white. So at this point, he not just didn't care, but actively discouraged African Americans from applying to Princeton. And at one point, I think this was when he was a professor at African American who had been accepted to law school, like walked into one of the class, and like all of the Southern students got up and walked out en masse. But what he did want to do was, you know, reform the sort of scholarly life of the institution. He hired about a third more professors that he personally screened. So the faculty went up from something like 115 or 120 to 175. He wanted to build all these like new buildings and new sort of academic edifices, basically. And he got a lot of pushback, I mean, from older faculty, from alumni, and he was constantly having to go to the alumni to raise the money because excuse me, the plan that he came out with was going to cost something like $7 million, and the entire endowment of Princeton at that point was, I think, about $4 million. So he spends a long time sort of engaged in this fight with the dean of the graduate school and with various sort of more wealthy alumni donors, because a lot of them are really committed to this sort of older mode of the university, the sort of, you know, the university is a kind of like drinking club with Greek letters. But what he's really sort of coming out for is a kind of a version of the sort of modern research university. So in this respect, I think he was very much ahead of his time. He was one of these very earnest people. You know, those of you who were there for the Teddy Roosevelt talk that I gave before, I really, you know, I said when I gave the talk, like I started out not kind of disliking or not being very warm to Teddy Roosevelt, and I really warmed up to the guy. Wilson, I never quite warmed up to personally. I can't imagine having a drink with him. He was a teetotaler anyway, but or at least for a lot of his life he was. But he was a very earnest guy. I mean, that's the thing that really that people always had to say about him, and that was the thing that really carried him through. So, as we shall see, he was also very committed to the South. These, I think, are two sort of very indicative quotes from him. One, he wrote in an article about John Bright, who was a British politician. I yield to no one in precedence and love for the South, but because I love the South, I rejoice in the failure of the Confederacy. Why is he saying that? Because the Confederacy, if it had won, by his lights, and I think he's right, would have really destroyed the South. The South could not have competed with the industrial base of the North. I mean, the Civil War, those of you who are, you know, native to this area will probably know, the Civil War really made this city. Cleveland had, I think, 0 foundries before the Civil War and had something like 50 by the end of it. I mean, really, the North had a lot more heavy industry. The South really had only one. I mean, Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond was, I think, the only major metalworking that they had at the time. And they would have, you know, I had a professor in college who pointed out that sort of the further below the Mason-Dixon line you go, excuse me, not so much today, but definitely in the 50s and before, the closer things got to things further south, right? So the South stayed predominantly agrarian for a lot of the time afterward, and if the Southern Confederacy had won, probably they would have become a kind of much more similar to what goes on in Latin America. Not that Latin America is terrible, but it doesn't have the kind of industrial development that we do in the sort of North and Northeast. The white men of the South were aroused by the mere instinct of self-preservation to rid themselves by fair means or foul of the intolerable burden of government sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes. I mean, this is one of the less rank things that he said, but it is rank. He was associated with D.W. Griffith, sort of through an intermediary, got him on board with the making of Birth of a Nation, which is a horribly racist movie, which basically, among other things, tries to sort of paint the Ku Klux Klan as a kind of heroic what have you. And he actually showed the movie when it came out. Wilson did at the White House. And the people who were the sort of publicists for Birth of a Nation tried to make it seem, they published this sort of fake quote, this is history written in lightning, and the only regrettable thing, it is so horribly true that this turned out to not be something that Wilson had actually said. Wilson was, I think, kind of horrified by the movie and asked that his name not be associated with it. But so 8 years after becoming president of Princeton, he gives a lot of talks in the course of being president of Princeton about politics, about the history of politics, about the American political system. And the New Jersey Democratic Party decides that he might be an interesting guy to have run for governor. Why do they think this? Why do they think some rank outsider is going to be a good governor? This is Sugar Jim Smith, who's the head of the New Jersey Democratic machine. And the reason basically that they thought this was that they thought that he would be a good sort of figurehead, right? That he would understand how to play ball. He wouldn't want to mess with them. They would get him this job, which would be kind of prestige position, and they could sort of distribute the pork, the spoils, what have you. So he manages to convince them that he's willing to play ball. I mean, he basically tells them, sure, I'm not interested in interfering with whatever. But he does it in a kind of a way that allowed them to believe what they wanted to believe about what he was going to do. He gets elected, and the first thing that happens is, this was back in the days when the senators from a state were, by and large, voted on by the state legislature. And Sugar Jim then went to Wilson and said, okay, right, so I'd like to be senator. And Wilson said, well, I don't know about that. What makes you think you'd be a very good senator? And there's this other guy, So the New Jersey party bosses discovered pretty quickly that what Wilson had meant when he said that he wasn't going to interfere was that he wasn't going to have anything to do with them, which is different. And in fact, Wilson then went on a kind of reforming. I mean, he was a very reform-minded guy. He reformed the election laws to broaden the franchise. Now, you can look at that and be like, well, if he's like a fan of Walter Paget and his whole opposition to constituency, why is he so fascinated with more people voting? And it's because what he wants is the decision to be taken by everybody. But then, once you've made this decision, then I'm going to go do what I assume you think I'm going to do, right? Because I've told you what kind of person I am and what sorts of things I believe. He passes what's called the Corrupt Practices Act that tries to crack down on cronyism and bribe taking. He passed the Workmen's Compensation Act. And he creates a Public Utilities Commission. Up until that point, public utilities were a major source of graft, and he created a commission to make sure that was done in a kind of more above-board type of way. So Wilson is a progressive, and this is in a period it's called now the Progressive Era, from the late 1890s to the late 1920s. These are very prominent muckraking journalists. So one thing that happened during the Progressive Era was this idea that there was too much concentration of wealth at the top, and that the people who were super wealthy were not well scrutinized. So you got these muckraking reporters like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens. Ida Tarbell wrote a series of very incisive investigative pieces on Standard Oil, making her very unpopular with people in the upper reaches of the income distribution, let's just say. Lincoln Steffens and Ray Stannard Baker. Ray Stannard Baker wrote mostly about things at the state level, and then eventually got to work in the sort of information service for Woodrow Wilson later on. But it was an era of where people were really pushing for government reform, so that the government would be run on a kind of more efficient and above-board basis. There was a big period in the movement for women's suffrage, leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, for tariff reform up until this point. So this is a kind of a interesting topic now. The United States had relatively high tariff barriers, and the idea was, well, we have like nascent industries here and we need to protect them. The English, by the way, were really horrified by this. The English were like, we must have free trade, which is the leading economy at any time wants free trade. And everyone else is like, well, I think we'd like some sort of protection. But the Democratic Party, particularly at this point, was very interested in reducing tariff barriers, and thus, and partly because they saw that American industry was growing so fast and so broadly that it would be really in our interest if we could, by cutting our own tariff barriers, encourage others to cut theirs, and thus facilitate greater circulation of trade. And that has sort of became the theory of American economic policy ever since, up until about 6 months ago. But that's another issue. The election of 1812. So those of you who remember the Woodrow Wilson talk will remember that Wilson, or the Woodrow Wilson, which we're having right now, the Teddy Roosevelt talk, that Roosevelt had left office and had been sort of replaced by his erstwhile friend, William Howard Taft, of the Possum and Taters. Taft was a much more conservative figure than Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt, by the sort of end of his life, had become, had very much part of the kind of Republican version of progressivism, very much into protection of the working man, very much into busting the trusts and the monopolies, or at least limiting the ability of monopoly situations to form. Now, just to be clear, I mean, this is a sort of necessary thing for the development of capitalism, because once you have a monopoly position, look at Microsoft. Microsoft has such an advantageous position that it's very difficult for any other company to break into the market for things that Microsoft does, because Microsoft controls a lot of proprietary technology. I guess a better example would be Amazon. Amazon is so big that they can achieve economies of scale on pretty much any product that they want to sell. So if you come up with some new product, you probably, and you're in competition with Amazon, Amazon can certainly sell it cheaper than you can, because they have so much money that they can sell at a loss, right? So when the election of 1912 rolled around, you had Taft, who was not especially popular, because he had tried to sort of move the Republican Party back to the sort of northeastern industrialists and financiers who controlled one broad wing of the party. Roosevelt this time had decided that he wanted to run again, so he was running on the Progressive Party ticket, which you also refer to as the Bull Moose ticket. And he was running mostly out in the western part of the country. And then you have Eugene V. Debs, the greatest of the American socialists, who was never going to win, but was out there sort of making a point. And the funny thing was that you had three guys here, Debs, Wilson, and Roosevelt, who were all pretty much coming out on a sort of a policy of, let's help the working man, let's help the little guy get ahead against the concentrations of wealth at the top end of society. Jennings Bryan, people remember William Jennings Bryan for a lot of reasons lately. One reason is because he was the winning lawyer in the Scopes monkey trial. Yeah. Well, he, in a moment, was asked by Clarence Darrow whether, if the Bible said that black was white, would he believe it? And he said yes. He was also a big crusader against the gold standard. He was a bimetallist. He thought that we should use the currency should be based on silver as well as gold, because using the gold standard is inherently deflationary. I'm not going to get into that vexed topic right now. If for no other reason than the gold standard is dead as a dormouse now. So, he was sort of one of the leading Western progressives, and he was did a lot to sort of get Wilson's sort of name out in the field in the Western Party of the United States. Then you have Edward Mandell House, otherwise known as Colonel House. House was a wealthy guy from Texas who wasn't, in fact, I think, a colonel, but who was a kind of political fixer. and came on board, decided that that Wilson was his sort of guy, and got on board. William Gibbs McAdoo. McAdoo eventually married one of Woodrow Wilson's daughters, I believe. Louis Brandeis, the great legal crusader for individual rights and the right to privacy, later elevated to the Supreme Court, the first Jew ever to be elevated to the Supreme Court. These were sort of the kind of brain trust of Wilson's campaign. So this is one of my sort of favorite Wilson cartoons. Here you have him. Those of you of a sort of more agrarian background will recognize priming the pump, which he's doing. He's saying, now watch her come, and what is he pointing? This is the business prosperity pump, and what he's using to prime it is antitrust legislation, currency legislation, and tariff legislation. So Wilson, when he becomes president, institutes a number of progressive measures. Now you can see I included this kind of professorial looking Wilson, and he's chasing, you kind of can't read it here, but it says big business, and he's out there chasing them with his ruler. But he undertook a number of measures, reduction of tariff barriers. He introduced the income tax, which was very minor at this point and mostly on very high incomes. He brought forward a new antitrust, a more extensive antitrust act after the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was earlier. He created the Federal Reserve System. Now this is an interesting thing. So another thing that Walter Paget was all about was, in a crisis, the government has to lend countercyclically. The government has to deficit lend in order to keep businesses liquid so that they can see their way through the crisis and then get back on a firmer footing. But Paget always said, if you're going to do this, the lending has to be at a very high rate of interest, and it has to only be with considerable collateral. And so this is a version of this is the sort of idea that Wilson had. We have these periodic banking crises. What needs to happen at that point is the government needs to step in as the kind of lender of last resort to keep businesses and banks solvent, so that you don't have bank runs, which then sort of cause the problem to spiral. So he creates the Federal Reserve System, a series of banks in regions across the United States where, when there are banking crises or downturns, these banks can lend to local businesses and banks as the lender of last resort. I mean, the reserve banks lend to banks, and then the banks will have money to help businesses stay afloat through the crisis period. I have a minute. I'm going to tell you something that I think is really interesting. In the 30s and up through today, there's sort of two theories about what happens in a crisis, right? There's the Austrian theory, Friedrich von Hayek and Joseph Schumpeter and people like that, who said basically, Schumpeter came up with the idea of creative destruction, right? There's sort of there's like cyclical downturns that destroy the weak businesses and create space for new, more efficient businesses to take their place. And so when you have a crisis, basically you just have to wait, right? And eventually it'll sort itself out. And then you have the Keynes theory, which is that Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. And that economists don't present themselves with a very difficult problem if they're just going to tell you in times of stress, well, we just have to wait. So Keynes says we have to lend countercyclically. And the reason I think this is interesting, although it's from a sort of later period, is that Joseph Schumpeter came out with this 2-volume book called Business Cycles, the point of which was there's always cyclical downturns and you just have to wait it out, right? And just before he was going to publish this, or slightly before, while he was working on it, Keynes came out with the general theory. Keynes' theory is you can fix business cycles by lending countercyclically. And it was a gigantic success, and Schumpeter was always kind of bitter about this, because he thought that Keynes' book was successful because it came out with a message that people wanted to hear. We can fix the problem. Whereas his book he thought was more sort of responsible or whatever. But anyway, this is a kind of proto, the theory is this is not quite Keynesianism yet. I mean, Keynesianism won't happen for another 20 years. But the theory is that we want to create a kind of reservoir of capital so that when these downturns happens, you don't get the thing like It's a Wonderful Life, where the bank run happens and mom and pop lose all their money, even though they haven't been the ones who are doing the risky things. As Wilson is sort of organizing his jigging of American politics, the lights go out across Europe after the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo in June of 1914. I really recommend to any of you who are interested in this topic Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers. It's, the state-of-the-art book on the origins of the First World War, which, in the wake of the war, all the winners got together and said, okay, Germany, you have to sign this thing that says that you were responsible for the whole thing, which the Germans were very upset about, but had no choice in the moment. But if you read Christopher Clark's book, they were all, there was guilt to go around. The French were lending money to buy weapons to the Serbians, and there was just all kinds of shenanigans going on. So, Wilson really wants to stay out of it, right? And once again, what had Washington said at the end of his life? Resist foreign entanglements. We don't need to get into Europe's problems. We've got our own. So he keeps, and he also, Wilson being a pretty canny interpreter of politics, I think saw that neither side was unequivocally right. He was also really annoyed at the way the British conducted themselves around the whole thing, and he really, we were never going to come in on the German side, but he didn't think very much of the British side either, so he wanted us to stay out. The British then start blockading Europe, which Wilson thought was illegal. The Germans respond by undertaking submarine warfare. Now there are sort of rules about it. Technically you're supposed to give the ship a warning or whatever, which, not surprised, that goes by the boards a lot of the time. You're in the submarine, you're like, oh yeah, let's just signal. Let's just, surface and see if any, planes or destroyers are around to sort us out. So what it resulted in was, in addition to the British, losing 100,000 tons a month of shipping, a number of uninvolved ships getting sunk too, neutrals. Wilson wanted to sort of mediate the war. There was a very strong pro-war faction, especially in the Republican Party at that time. You can see Wilson kind of peeking out his door, and this is the American war dog. You can't read that very well, but which he's studiously trying to ignore. One interesting thing, and this is one sort of profound change that occurs in the course of the First World War, is that, so the Germans fund the war basically all on credit. They do a series of kind of war bond drives where they they sort of do these kind of war loans. The British, who have a lot of sort of assets that they can use, originally fund it that way and then start accessing US financial markets. And one consequence of this is a big sort of inflationary spiral that goes on in the United States, because the British are sort of accessing a lot of the resources that otherwise, now not military stuff to begin with, but obviously because we're not in the war and we're not coming in on their side. But we see two, they're periodic. There's the sinking of the SS Arabic, 1915, and the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, May of 1916, in which 120 Americans, I think, were killed. It's not clear that the Lusitania was not doing some military thing too. So, but each time this happens, the State Department keeps going to the Germans and saying, okay, let's be clear, this is not okay. And the Germans say, yeah, that was an unfortunate error. We're clearing it up now, right? And it just keeps happening over and over. So there's a revolution that's gone on down in Mexico, and what happens is the sort of legitimate president gets executed, and Wilson was one of these guys who was a real stickler for doing things the right way. So he refuses to recognize the new guy, and then we get into all these sort of there's a kind of guerrilla war. Blackjack Pershing is leading troops into Mexico trying to chase down Pancho Villa. Now, this is an interesting thing. So another thing we were talking about in the men's book group is the sort of, there's imperialism and then there's imperialism, right? So Wilson really wanted to sort of an end to European imperialism. What he meant by this was an end to European states fighting it out over possession of Africa or what have you. But this is not to say that he did not want U.S. influence. I mean, in the course of Wilson's tenure, we intervene in Haiti, we intervene in the DR, we intervene in lots of places, point south. But what Wilson wants is kind of what's called the open door policy. He wants a sort of free movement of American goods and capital. And the Europeans can never quite get their heads around this, so that, once again, those of you who saw the Franklin Roosevelt talk will remember that Roosevelt was constantly chiding the Europeans about imperialism, right? He was constantly giving it to Churchill about British imperialism. And Churchill couldn't quite understand. I mean, number one, Churchill thought that the British Empire was doing a lot of good for the people in the empire, but he also thought that it's a little weird to hear, given what we were doing in the Philippines or in Panama or in name your Latin American state. So a lot of it is sort of talking past each other. Wilson runs for re-election in 1916. The slogan, "He kept us out of the war," which was true. He ran against Charles Evans Hughes, who'd been the governor of New York. They had roughly similar platforms, except that Hughes was, Wilson could count on the Solid South, right? He was a Southerner, he spoke their language, he had a certain sympathy with the ethnic structure of their society. And so basically it was then, but the Republican candidate had to sort of keep Northeastern industrial and financial elites on board while also trying to run a kind of progressive campaign. And sort of Hughes' campaign mostly spiraled, and somebody asked Woodrow Wilson why it was that he wasn't attacking Hughes more, to which his response was, "Never attack a man who's committing suicide," which I think is a pretty good piece of political advice. This is Wilson announcing his candidacy at the White House. You can kind of see him. This is the 1912 election. The blue states are states that Wilson won. The green states are states that Teddy Roosevelt won. And the red states are states that Taft won. And you'll notice one state that Taft did not win was the state of Ohio, his home state, sadly enough. This is the 1916 electoral map. Hughes, you can see, has strong support in the Northeast and in the Great Lakes region, although once again he does not win Ohio. Wilson has the solid South and also the progressive West, with the exception of Oregon, and who knows what goes on there. I mean, I've lived in Oregon and I couldn't tell you. Yeah, there are a bunch of contrarians out there, so I'm not surprised that they went for Hughes. The thing that really gets us into the war, one of the sort of big things is this, the Germans start, I mean, things get worse and worse with us and the Germans and sinking ships. Then the Germans try and encourage the Mexicans to go to war with us. They send their foreign minister, Zimmerman, sends a telegram to the president of Mexico in January 1917, which British intelligence intercepts and holds on to for a couple of months, waiting for the right time to tell us about this, which then they do, and there's a real wave of outrage that goes on. By this time, things are going pretty well for the Allies. So 1916 had been a pretty savage year. The Allies had been planning a series of attacks along the front. The Germans, having gotten wind of this, staged their gigantic attack on the French fortress complex of Verdun, which is an incredibly brutal battle. The Allies, trying to sort of like get back on an even keel, then staged the Battle of the Somme, one of the most incredibly brutal battles in the history of modern warfare. I mean, I think that the British took something like 20,000 casualties in the first hour of the Battle of the Somme. This is at a time too, you would think you would know better in 1916, but people ran out when the charges happened at the Battle of the Somme. They like bombarded them for about a week, and then they ran out with their soccer balls and swagger sticks, and that ended about as poorly as you would think. America declares war on the 6th of April, 1917. In January of 1918, by just jumping ahead, briefly, Wilson gives his 14-point speech. And this is really, so the 14 points, which we'll discuss in a minute, was kind of the basis on which we were going to participate in this war, right? So it wasn't going to be, if we're going to do this war, right, it's not just going to be like for this block or that block. We've got to, you know, Wilson is like, we have to have this idealistic purpose. And this is what it's going to be. By the beginning of 1918, Russia has pretty much collapsed, and with the Bolsheviks taken over. And the Bolsheviks, Lenin has pretty much promised, Lenin's slogan vis-a-vis the war was bread and peace. He essentially pulls Russia out of the war and signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where he gives up this large hunk of the Ukraine, Estonia, what was then called Livonia, and a large slug of property. Basically, he just, you know, signs this treaty with the Germans to get them out of the war. And the Germans get, you know, the sort of German aims vis-a-vis the East were very consistent for a long time. What they want is access to this enormous Ukrainian breadbasket. I mean, that was the whole sort of basis of the Nazi idea of Lebensraum. Like, what we want is access to the Russian steppes where we can grow wheat for this growing population, and that's really what the Germans wanted, the Germans in the imperial period wanted as well. So having freed up, you can see the connection between these two. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk signed at the beginning of March. In the third week of March, the Germans start this massive offensive on the Western Front and nearly win the war. I mean, it is really close. The French armies have suffered a series of mutinies. The Allies are right at the breaking point. I mean, it's really, I recommend for a number of reasons seeing the recent Wonder Woman movie, because one of the points, there's a lot of gross historical inaccuracies in that movie, let's just be clear. But one of the things which is not inaccurate is that the Ludendorff offensive in the spring of 1918 came about this close to the Germans winning the war, to the Axis powers winning the war. It's only really because we start showing up first in terms of materiel and then in terms of men in large numbers that the Allies are able to hold on. I mean, you know, you think of those like streams of US troops marching in through France shouting, you know, Lafayette, nous voilà, Lafayette, we're here. That was a very powerful movement. And by the summer of 1918, 10,000 US troops are arriving every day. At first the French are like, well, let's just use your guys as replacements, right? We just need to get them in the frontline units. And the US Army is like, well, I don't think we're going to be doing that. But we will put them under the overall French command as long as Blackjack Pershing gets to have a say as well. And our guys fight quite well. They're still remembered for Chateau Thierry, the Battle of Belleau Wood, which took most of June 1918, and which was kind of the sort of blooding of the modern Marine Corps. And this also is remembered, by the way, like if you ever go down in Cleveland Heights where I live, you can tell when a lot of those streets were built because they have names from the First World War battlefields all around. This is the sort of announcement. I just put this, you know, I have to admit I put this because I grew up near Spokane and I used to take the Spokesman Review. But, you know, once again, when Wilson gets us into the war, he then has to build this gigantic infrastructure to get men into the army and trained to handle rationing of food and materials, because once again, there's a limited amount and it has to be sort of distributed. So he starts a number of boards to supervise these tasks, and in doing so, really dramatically expands the government's reach into the way Americans live their life on a daily basis. So once again, this is a very pronounced change. And it gets sort of undone at the end of the war, right? But and it also has to do with, you know, those of you who remember the Franklin Roosevelt talk, remember that Churchill kept going to Franklin Roosevelt and saying, well, send us something, right? You got to do something because Hitler's a terrible guy. And Franklin Roosevelt keeps saying, well, I would love to, but the U.S. Congress has passed 6 neutrality acts in the last 5 years, and I can't really, sorry, my hands are tied. And one reason was, the whole experience had a very profound influence on Americans. It had a very profound influence on Europeans too. I mean, people wonder why were the European powers so willing to kind of accede to Hitler's demands, especially with regard to Czechoslovakia. And it's because they were so traumatized by the horrors of the First World War that they were willing to do practically anything to keep from getting into another one. Once the victory is won, Wilson spends 6 months at the Treaty of Versailles, the first sitting president of the United States to go to Europe. The victorious powers are demanding 132 billion marks in reparations, is about $442 billion, which is a gigantic sum. And they're also demanding that the Germans sign Article 231, which is the war guilt clause. And Wilson starts out by trying to kind of ameliorate this, because what he doesn't want is a kind of Carthaginian peace, right? He doesn't want a peace that's just going to lead to another war. And he has this idea for a League of Nations, that is to say, a kind of a sovereign organization above the level of the nation state. In doing all this, he also wins the Nobel Prize. This is the sort of Det Norske Storting's Nobel Committee. This is his sort of certificate for having won the Nobel Peace Prize. So these are some images from the Treaty of Versailles. This is the signing ceremony in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. This is Clemenceau, the French president, David Lloyd George, and Orlando, the Italian premier. This is the German delegation looking kind of bummed. This is Lawrence of Arabia and a number of Middle Eastern figures. And this is a fellow who would come to be known as Ho Chi Minh. I was going to say Nguyen Ai Quoc, but that was an intermediate point on the way to Ho Chi Minh, who had been a founding member of the French Communist Party. France at that point ruled Indochina, and tried to get into the conference because, as we'll see when we talk in a minute here about the 14 points, the whole idea, look, Wilson had really mooted the idea that, we should have, nations should be self-governing, right? And Ho Chi Minh, whose real name was Nguyen. I mean, Nguyen is like Smith in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh saw this and was like, yeah, that's great, right? We think that Vietnam, that Indochina should be self-governing, and the European powers we weren't really talking about you. We were talking about Romanians and what have you. And the same way with Lawrence. Lawrence was trying to sort of get the kind of Middle Eastern situation sorted out to no really good effect at that particular moment. All right, so Wilson's 14 points. Reliance on open diplomacy rather than secret agreements. This is probably there were a lot of secret treaties before the war, so probably not a terrible idea. Freedom of the seas. A number of countries, the British really had a problem with freedom of the seas because it didn't really mean that, because they were a sea power. Free trade, right? So we're going to get rid of tariff barriers and we're going to have free trade. Reductions in military forces and weapons. Allowance for Russia to self-determine its own government. This looked a lot better before people really realized what was going on. I mean, at the time, the Russian Civil War was still going on, so it wasn't exactly clear how things were going to shake out. Respect for Belgium's integrity. When the Nazis invaded Belgium, they went through Louvain, which is the sort of great center of Northern European Catholicism. It was where the Jesuits tended to go when they got expelled from wherever. There was a gigantic library there which had thousands of priceless and unique documents, and then the Germans burned it. And then in the Second World War, they went through Louvain again and burned it again. Restoration of French territory. Italy receives territory based upon ethnicity, which meant that what the Italians wanted was more possessions on the Dalmatian coast. Austria-Hungary receives fair development opportunities. Austria-Hungary was in the process of falling to bits anyway. I mean, this is really what this kind of national thing was, that it was, you make, there's a sort of rump German Austria, and then there's Hungary as its own country, and Czechoslovakia, which is two countries sort of made into one, but creation of the Turkish state, independence for Poland. This ends up with a very unfortunate situation in which they decide that Poland needs a seaport, so they create this corridor going up to the city of Danzig, which turns into a sort of real bone of contention for the German nationalists. And the most important one, the 14th point, the formation of a League of Nations to guarantee independence for all countries large and small. Now, the League of Nations was subject to its own separate treaty and had a number of important articles to it, one of which being that the League could declare war and sort of compel, like say someone was being a bad actor, the League could kind of declare war on them. So the problem with the League that everybody had, with one thing and another, was that it compromised the sovereignty of the individual nation states. And you can kind of see, you know, this is a thing that comes up a lot in sort of modern politics, right? You know, why is it that countries are hinky about being part of the International Criminal Court? Because it compromises their sovereignty. This is a political cartoon, and it has the European baby show, and it has poor old Wilson trying to sort of wrangle the European powers into doing what they're supposed to do. At this point, Wilson was he had been suffering from hardening of the arteries for a long time. And his doctor had people talk about Donald Trump playing a lot of golf. Woodrow Wilson holds the record, and I'm sure this will never be broken, for the largest number of rounds of golf played by a sitting president. He played something like 1,200 rounds of golf. And it's because his doctor had told him that he needed to do something to relax every day. So every day in the afternoon, he would either go for a drive or he'd play golf with his wife. His first wife died in 1914 from Bright's disease, which is the same kidney disease that killed Teddy Roosevelt's first wife. But he and his wife would go out and play golf. He was not a very good golfer. He was like a 40 handicap. And she was worse. I mean, I think she used to shoot around 200. But that's fine, you know, the point is the exercise and the walking around. Apparently she was doing quite a lot of it. I mean, if you're shooting 200, you're chasing a lot of worm burners around the course. But so he gets, at a certain point, he has a sort of mild stroke, and he's getting sicker and sicker. And so he goes back to the United States. He leaves Colonel House in charge of the negotiations, right? He's just like, you know, just sort of hold down the fort, right? I'll go back, and I'm going to talk to the Republicans, because the Republicans are making a lot of noise about how they hate the treaty. And right, the treaty has to get 2/3 majority in the Senate to pass. The leader of the sort of opposition to it was Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge, who had been very pro-war, but who thought that the treaty sort of as propounded, the League of Nations idea, too extensively compromised U.S. sovereignty. So this is some really, I think, great political cartoons. This is, Wilson is here offering the olive branch to a dove, and it's like, it says League of Nations, and it says, overweight, here's your olive branch. Like, this is a little heavy, don't you think? And then here's Wilson blowing a bubble that's a League of Nations out of a tub that says idealism. Here's Wilson in a whirlpool that's labeled public opinion. There's his political prestige in kind of ruins here, and he's holding on to this little board that says League of Nations on it. And then if there's any man who can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let him speak. This is foreign entanglements. There's Uncle Sam, and then you can see the U.S. Senate bursting in through the church window to speak its piece. Wilson returns to, after a series of very unsatisfactory meetings with the Congress, with members of the Senate, to find that House has allowed the Europeans to kind of, has basically made all kinds of concessions. And his annoyance with House is such that he breaks with House, who's been his friend for a long time. And finally, he's forced to, he becomes much more hawkish about the Germans in the attempt to sort of get everybody on board with this thing. And as a result, they end up with a treaty which is, has very unfortunate consequences for the Germans. Not only do they lose a lot of territory, but they're saddled with gigantic reparations, which, and the problem is that these reparations are not ultimately denominated in their own currency. So you then get, through a series of other problems, the German hyperinflation of 1922, 1923. By the way, hyperinflation really only happens when you have large debts denominated not in your currency, by the way. Wilson collapses on the 25th of September, suffers a stroke on the 2nd of October. While the Congress is in the process of not ratifying the League of Nations, he works out some other things, like, for instance, the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. Also prohibition, which he thought was a great idea. And I will point out to you, those of you who were not at the Franklin Roosevelt talk, that one of the first two things that Franklin Roosevelt did two things when he became president. One was to alter the banking laws to try and stop the banking crisis. The other one was to get rid of prohibition, because we all need a drink. Or that is to say, if you want one, you should be able to have one. We're all adults here. And I didn't know that about Franklin Delano Roosevelt before I started, but I got a lot more respect for the guy after I read that. Because let me tell you what, in 1932, people needed a drink. Eventually, he suffers a further series of strokes. He was mostly incapacitated for much of the last year of his life by strokes and hardening of the arteries. And a lot of people look at Wilson's career and say, well, it's kind of shaped by this catastrophic failure at the end, the failure of the League of Nations, the failure of the Versailles Treaty to establish a lasting peace in Europe. But I think that if you look at the sort of larger scope of Wilson's politics, there's a lot to be impressed with. He really, there's the Adamson Act that instituted the 8-hour day and created overtime. There's the 19th Amendment. I think every woman in this country who can look at, of whatever political stripe, the arguments against women voting were pretty ridiculous, and Wilson and his administration were central to getting the 19th Amendment passed. His administration had a lot of salutary effects in terms of, once again, trying to break down trusts and monopolies so that the economy would work better, right? If you're a businessman, you ask any businessman, what would you prefer, free competition or a monopoly? They want the second thing. The free market is great, but if I can just set whatever price for the thing I'm selling with no competition, that's a better situation for me. I may have some sort of idealism about whatever, but Wilson, within the context of wanting American business to be successful, said, look, let's stop these situations that create anti-competitive conditions. If we're going to do free market capitalism, let's really do it. Right? Let's really have a free market that doesn't have sort of an oligopolistic structure where a bunch of the large units are crushing out all the small ones. Let's create a situation in which people can really innovate, people can really build businesses and not get crushed out by the sort of, some of you have seen that that picture of the kind of octopus of the sort of rail system that was the sort of guiding point for the Frank Norris novel, among other things. So you can look at it and say, in the final hour, Wilson's policies didn't win through, and the consequences for not having done so were pretty catastrophic. If you just look at the 30 years that followed, many grim things happened because the end of the First World War was not handled properly. But that's not really Wilson's fault. Right? Wilson may have been a little overly idealistic, but he had the right idea. Just people were not quite in a position to see it. And it took 30 more years of very bitter lessons before people were in a position to understand that we needed a kind of governance structure above the level of the nation state to sort out the problems before they get to the Archduke getting shot again, or someone trying to clip off pieces of Czechoslovakia. Also, by the end of Wilson's tenure, the British, sort of around the end of the war, decide they're going to go back on the gold standard, which turns out to be a really terrible idea because it causes a massive deflation, and they eventually have to abandon the idea. But what becomes clear is that London is no longer the center of financial power in the world. We are. New York is. And that's a crucial thing. We are in the position we are right now. We, all of us as Americans, are in the position right now because we are the lender of last resort for the earth. And we are in that position because the financial institutions in New York became the sort of nerve center for the world, for world financial transactions, which are the kind of lifeblood in a lot of respects of the brick and mortar economy. Now, granted, we then after this go into a period of kind of isolation where, once again, we're like old Europe, let it just sort itself out. And it takes another catastrophic event in the 30s and 40s to kind of bring us out of that. But we are at least alive to what's going on in Europe. Now, in a weird way, you can look at it and say the thing that really got us into the Second World War was not what was going on in Europe, right? It was Pearl Harbor, which is a world away from that. But it makes us a player on the world stage in a way that we kind of hadn't been before. Our Navy increases in size dramatically. And we become a world power in a way. Now, we choose mostly not to sort of flex that muscle outside of our own sphere, right? But by and large, we are a power, and everybody knows it. So that all of the powers in Europe, when the Second World War starts, have in the back of their minds, what are the Americans going to do? Hitler, constantly thinking, what are the Americans going to do? Stalin, what are the Americans going to do? Churchill, please do something now before we go down for the third time. So sure, there were some failures that can be associated with Wilson. But I think that if you look at the large balance sheet of his career and of his administration in the United States, what we have is arguably the most profound change that goes on at any single point, at least until the New Deal, and maybe until afterward. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out. Please come and see Truman, and yes, thank you so much.